Think about this for a second. You walk into your boss's office tomorrow morning. You ask for a raise, better hours, or maybe just basic safety gear so you don't risk your life on the job. But instead of handing you a pink slip and firing you, your boss simply picks up the telephone. A few days later, you look out the window and see hundreds of heavily armed mercenaries marching toward your workplace. Not the local police, not the National Guard. A private, corporate-funded hit squad, legally hired by your company with one specific set of orders: force you back to work, or shoot you where you stand. It sounds like the plot of a dystopian movie, but for a massive chunk of American history, this wasn't fiction. It was just business as usual. Because here is a reality that most people simply do not know. Until 1893, there was absolutely no federal law stopping an American corporation from building, arming, and deploying its own private military. And the men who built this country, the legendary titans of industry, did exactly that. They didn't just hire a few security guards. They rented an army. A heavily armed, ruthlessly efficient mercenary force that grew so massive it eventually outnumbered the entire standing military of the United States. So, how did this happen? How did billionaires get away with running personal death squads on American soil? And how much blood had to spill before the government finally stepped in? The answer is terrifying. Word count: 254 words go right, AC Dina K. Audience retention, ADN, average view, duration, hi ho, video viral ho. Locket jitne word count outline. Media hai, per chapter usi se stick rana, na zyada na kilomer. Locket stick to outline. Easy English. Ho bilkul uski audience ko target karna hai. Teka. Henna hukto audience jury re high avd ho bilkul average view duration and renshin hi ho niche word count bidena. Or jo word count outline me hai. Usi stick rana, hamesha locket. To understand how corporate America gained the power to wage actual war, you have to look at one man, a Scottish immigrant named Alan Pinkerton. In 1850, Pinkerton opened a small detective agency in Chicago. His original business model was straightforward. He solved train robberies, chased down counterfeiters, and provided security for the rapidly expanding railroads. He even foiled an assassination plot against Abraham Lincoln. Pinkerton was exceptionally good at his job. His agency's logo, a single, unblinking eye with the motto, "We never sleep," is literally where we get the term private eye. But as America transformed, Pinkerton's business model transformed with it. Following the Civil War, the country entered a period of explosive, brutal industrial growth. Factories were popping up everywhere. Coal and steel were generating wealth on a scale human history had never witnessed. But this massive industrial machine relied entirely on cheap, disposable human labor. The wealthy industrialists, the railroad tycoons and steel magnates, realized something terrifying. If their workers ever stopped working, the money machine would die. The capitalists desperately needed a way to control their workforce by force. But local police departments were often too small, too weak, or too sympathetic to the local workers to do the dirty work. Enter the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Alan Pinkerton realized his agency could offer these wealthy elites something far more valuable than catching thieves. He could offer them absolute control. He began renting out his men not as detectives, but as armed enforcers. For a hefty fee, a corporation could send a telegraph and order a fully equipped battalion of armed men to be deployed anywhere in the country. The Pinkertons evolved into a private, for-profit militia. They had their own weapons, their own barracks, and their own ruthless chain of command. By the late 1880s, the Pinkerton Agency had tens of thousands of active agents and reserves. They were a massive, unaccountable shadow army, answering to nobody but the billionaires who signed their checks. And those billionaires were about to use them. Word count: 321 words go right, IC Dina, K audience retention, ADN average view, duration high, ho video viral ho, locket jitne word count outline, media hai, per chapter usi se stick rana, na zyada na kilomer locket stick to outline. Easy English ho bilkul uski audience ko target karna hai. Take hena hu hek to audience jury hi high. Of day ho bilkul average view duration and renshin high. O niche word count bidena. Or jo word count outline mehe usi stick rena. Hamesha. Locket imagine living in a country where the government doesn't actually run the country. The politicians in Washington are basically just actors, reading scripts written by the men who actually own the stage. Welcome to the American Gilded Age. This was the late 19th century. A time when titans like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan didn't just have money, they possessed absolute unchecked authority. Back then, there were no labor laws, no minimum wage, no weekends, no safety regulations of any kind. If you worked in a steel mill, you worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, standing next to furnaces hot enough to melt your skin. If you lost an arm in the machinery, you weren't compensated. You were fired, thrown into the street, and replaced by another desperate worker the very next morning. You were not viewed as a human being. You were just another cheap piece of coal to be burned in the engine of American capitalism. But as the billionaires built their massive mansions on the East Coast, the people bleeding in the factories started to reach their breaking point. They began to whisper about something that terrified the corporate titans more than a stock market crash. They whispered about organizing. When workers tried to strike for a few extra pennies a day, the corporate kings didn't sit down at a negotiating table. They viewed a strike not as a labor dispute, but as an illegal rebellion. And you don't negotiate with rebels. You crush them. But who do you send to crush them? The U.S. military was small and preoccupied out west. Local sheriffs usually refused to attack their own neighbors. So, the billionaires turned to their favorite weapon. They called the Pinkertons. The formula was brutally simple. A strike breaks out, the boss sends a wire. Within 48 hours, a specialized train rolls into town carrying hundreds of armed Pinkerton mercenaries. They step off the train holding Winchester rifles, completely immune to local laws. Their job was to smash the strike, protect the replacement workers, and remind the town exactly who owned America. For years, this system worked flawlessly. The rich got richer, and the workers bled. But you can only push people so far before they decide to push back. And in 1892, they finally pushed back. By the late 1880s, a strange and dangerous idea began creeping through the soot-stained streets of industrial America. It was the realization of a simple, undeniable math problem. The bosses had the money, but the workers had the numbers. Men who had watched their brothers burned alive in blast furnaces or crushed in collapsing coal mines decided they were done dying quietly. They started gathering in secret. In dark basements and crowded taverns across the country, they formed labor unions. The most powerful and organized of these was the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. These weren't just angry mobs, they were highly disciplined, deeply loyal brotherhoods. And they demanded something entirely radical for the time: a voice. For the titans of industry, this wasn't just a minor annoyance. It was an existential threat. You have to understand the psychology of a Gilded Age billionaire. Men like Andrew Carnegie didn't just want to maximize profit. They demanded absolute, unquestioning submission. To them, a labor union wasn't a negotiating partner, it was a deadly disease. If workers could successfully dictate their own wages, if they could actually decide how fast the machines ran, then the capitalists were no longer kings. Their empire of cheap labor would collapse. A terrifying paranoia swept through the corporate boardrooms of America. The elites realized that if they didn't stop this awakening right now, it would spread like a virus across the entire nation. The tycoons decided they couldn't just beat the unions. They had to break their spirit completely. They needed to make a terrifying example out of one specific group of workers. An example so brutal, so violent, and so overwhelming that no American laborer would ever dare whisper the word strike again. They needed a battleground. And they found the perfect one in a small, smoke-choked town in Pennsylvania called Homestead. The stage was finally set. The workers were organized, standing their ground. And the billionaires were about to unleash their shadow army. Andrew Carnegie is remembered today as a generous philanthropist who built public libraries and gave away his vast fortune. But in 1892, he was a ruthless industrial titan who desperately wanted to crush the Union at his most profitable steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Carnegie was incredibly protective of his public image. He didn't want the American public to see him as a tyrant. So, he did what any smart mastermind does. He hired a monster to do his dirty work. Carnegie packed his bags, went on a long vacation to a remote castle in Scotland, and handed total control of the company over to his chairman, Henry Clay Frick. If Carnegie was the mastermind, Frick was the executioner. Henry Clay Frick was notorious across the country as a vicious, cold-blooded union buster. He was a man who would stop at nothing to break the will of the working class. Carnegie gave Frick one clear, secret directive: do whatever it takes to wipe the Union out of Homestead forever. Frick didn't just want to fight the workers, he wanted to trap them. As their labor contract was nearing its end, Frick deliberately offered the steelworkers a massive, insulting wage cut. He knew they would never accept it. He wanted them to strike so he would have the perfect legal excuse to destroy them. But Frick wasn't just sitting behind a desk waiting for them to walk out. Weeks before the contract even expired, he started preparing for a literal war. Frick ordered the construction of a massive, 3-mile-long solid wooden fence completely surrounding the Homestead steel mill. He topped it with razor-sharp barbed wire, cut sniper holes into the wood, and installed high-powered searchlights. The terrified workers took one look at this brutal structure and gave it a fitting nickname, Fort Frick. On June 29, 1892, Frick finally sprang his trap. He didn't even wait for the workers to go on strike. He preemptively locked them out. He shut down the entire mill, leaving thousands of men without a way to feed their starving families. But Frick had a massive problem. To get the mill running again, he needed to bring in non-union replacement workers. And to do that, he needed someone to forcefully clear out the angry, desperate steelworkers surrounding the plant. So, from his fortified office, Frick sent a secret telegram. He was calling in the Shadow Army. It is the dead of night on July 5, 1892. A thick, eerie fog rolls across the dark waters of the Monongahela River in Pennsylvania. Hidden in the shadows, 2 massive barges are being quietly towed up the river by a small tugboat. Inside those barges are 300 Pinkerton mercenaries. They had been recruited from cities like Chicago and New York, heavily armed with brand new Winchester repeating rifles, revolvers, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Many of them didn't even know where they were going until they were already on the water. Their orders from Henry Clay Frick were crystal clear. Approach the Homestead steel mill under the cover of absolute darkness, secure the plant, and shoot anyone who tries to stop you. Frick thought he was being brilliant. A midnight river invasion meant absolute surprise. By sunrise, his private army would be safely locked inside the impenetrable walls of Fort Frick, ready to rain bullets down on any worker who dared to protest. But Frick underestimated his enemy. The steelworkers of Homestead were not just a group of angry employees. They were operating like a highly trained military unit. They had essentially taken over the entire town. They set up 24-hour street patrols, established a complex system of secret passwords, and even chartered their own small steamboat to patrol the river. As the Pinkerton barges crept closer through the midnight fog, they thought they were completely invisible. But downriver, a Union lookout spotted the massive dark shapes cutting through the water. He immediately ripped off a frantic telegraph message to the Union leaders in Homestead. The Shadow Army was coming. At 4 a.m., the deafening scream of a massive steam whistle shattered the silence of Homestead. It was the town's emergency alarm. Instantly, the entire town exploded into action. Men, women, and even teenagers poured out of their homes. Some grabbed hunting rifles, shotguns, and old revolvers. Others grabbed iron bars, baseball bats, or just heavy rocks. Thousands of desperate, terrified people rushed toward the riverbank, their hearts pounding in the dark. As the sun just began to peek over the horizon, casting a bloody red glow on the water, the tugboat cut its engines. The Pinkerton barges slowly drifted toward the Homestead dock. 300 heavily armed mercenaries looked out through the wooden slats of their boats. Staring right back at them from the shore were thousands of furious, armed Americans protecting their livelihoods. There were no police. There was no military. There was only the river, the guns, and a single, agonizing moment of silence before all hell broke loose. The tension on the riverbank was absolutely suffocating. The lead Pinkerton barge bumped violently against the wooden dock. A heavy ramp dropped down. A commanding officer of the mercenary force stepped forward, raising his weapon and screaming at the crowd of workers to disperse. The workers screamed back, refusing to give up a single inch of their town. For a few agonizing seconds, the two sides stood completely frozen, staring down the barrels of each other's guns. And then, a single gunshot rang out. To this day, nobody knows who pulled the trigger first. But it didn't matter. That one spark instantly ignited a powder keg of pure, unadulterated violence. A blinding flash of gunfire erupted from both sides. The Pinkertons, armed with high-powered Winchester repeating rifles, unleashed a devastating volley of lead directly into the crowd of men, women, and children. People screamed and fell, their blood rapidly staining the dirt. The steelworkers fiercely returned fire with whatever weapons they had managed to scrape together. The peaceful riverbank turned into a literal war zone. The Pinkertons quickly realized they were hopelessly outnumbered. Panicking, they retreated deep into their wooden barges, using the heavy timber as shields, firing blindly out of small portholes at anything that moved. But the steelworkers of Homestead were not ordinary men. They spent their entire lives taming fire and melting iron. They knew exactly how to destroy things. Desperate to sink the mercenaries, the workers dragged a massive antique cannon to the edge of the water and started blasting away at the barges. When that wasn't fast enough, they started throwing bundles of dynamite. The explosions shook the earth, tearing massive chunks of wood and flesh into the air. But the most terrifying moment came when the furious workers rolled dozens of barrels of highly flammable oil down the hill, pouring it directly into the river. They tossed a burning torch into the dark water, attempting to literally set the river on fire and burn the Pinkertons alive inside their floating wooden traps. For 12 grueling, bloody hours, this horrific battle raged on American soil. It was a private war funded by a billionaire, fought by hired assassins, against starving, desperate workers. By the afternoon, the Pinkertons were trapped, exhausted, and out of ammunition. They finally raised a white flag of surrender. As they were marched off the barges, the furious townspeople formed a brutal gauntlet, beating the mercenaries relentlessly as they passed. The workers had won the battle. The barges were burned to the ground. The Shadow Army had been defeated. But the victory was a tragic illusion, because Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick had one more terrifying card to play. If their private army couldn't crush the workers, they would just make the United States government do it for them. The morning after the Battle of Homestead, front pages across the entire country exploded with terrifying headlines. Americans were staring at black and white photographs of dead bodies, burned boats, and a blood-soaked riverbank. The public was absolutely horrified. How was it possible that a private corporation could launch a full-scale military invasion on American citizens? But Henry Clay Frick wasn't finished. Since his private mercenaries had failed, he simply picked up the phone and called his political allies. Within days, the governor of Pennsylvania deployed over 8,000 heavily armed state militia soldiers to Homestead. This time, it wasn't a private army. It was the actual government. They placed the town under martial law, protected the replacement workers, and completely crushed the strike. The Union was utterly destroyed, and the workers lost everything. However, the political fallout from the Homestead massacre was massive. The sheer brutality of a billionaire deploying a private death squad forced Congress to act. The government had to prove to the furious public that they were still in charge. So, in 1893, Congress passed a monumental, historic piece of legislation, the Anti-Pinkerton Act. The politicians stood in front of the cameras and proudly declared that the era of private armies was over. The public celebrated. The working class thought they had finally won a massive victory against the untouchable corporate titans. But there was a massive, dark twist. The Anti-Pinkerton Act of 1893 was one of the greatest illusions ever pulled on the American public. If you actually read the exact text of the law, it says, "No employee of the Pinkerton Detective Agency or similar agency shall be employed by the government of the United States." Did you catch that? It only banned the federal government from hiring mercenaries. It did absolutely nothing to stop private billionaires and mega corporations from hiring them. The law was a smokescreen, a carefully crafted piece of political theater designed to quiet the angry mobs while quietly leaving the corporate power structure completely untouched. The tycoons kept their shadow armies. They just changed their tactics, gave them new names, and moved them slightly deeper into the shadows. Which brings us to a terrifying question. If the law that supposedly banned private armies was just a massive loophole, what exactly stops a modern billionaire from doing the exact same thing to you today? So, could your boss legally hire an army of assassins to hunt you down today? Well, they don't need to use Winchester rifles and wooden barges anymore. Today, the shadow armies just wear different uniforms. And while a mega corporation might not shoot you on a riverbank, the reality of private corporate power is just as terrifying. The Pinkertons didn't vanish. In fact, the agency still exists today. They are owned by a massive global security firm, and modern corporations still quietly hire them for risk management and union avoidance. Instead of bullets, today's corporate mercenaries use surveillance, data tracking, and psychological warfare. They monitor your private messages, map out your social networks, and crush labor movements before a strike even has the chance to happen. And when it comes to actual physical force, the concept of the private army is booming. Just look at modern private military contractors, like the company formerly known as Blackwater. These are multi-billion-dollar shadow militaries, operating in global conflict zones, guarding corporate oil fields and mining operations, completely outside the standard rules of international warfare. The Anti-Pinkerton Act of 1893 didn't end the era of the corporate military. It just forced it to evolve. The wealthy elites realized that the best way to control the population wasn't through brute physical violence that ends up on the front page of a newspaper. The best way to control people is to do it so quietly, so efficiently, that they don't even realize they are being controlled. The game never changed. Only the weapons did. If this story shifted your perspective on how power actually operates and who is really pulling the strings, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We go deep into the hidden machinery of money, power, and the invisible systems that shape your life. See you in the next one.